All right, good evening. Oh, come on, good evening. There we go. I am Dr. LaRonda Manigo-Bryant, Dr. Ron, and I am the new director of the Sonia Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History. Hello. It's truly my honor to be with you all tonight. This is my second day physically on campus. So it's especially good to be here. And on the second night of what is typically called Black History Month, but what we call in our house, Black Futures Month. In the spirit of the future, while we're here, I want to bring your attention to a future event. The inaugural Dr. Jenna Ray McNeil Endowed Black History Month lecture with guest speaker Dr. Vincent Brown will happen later on this month, February 22nd. Dr. Brown is the Charles Warren Professor of American History and the interim director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard. That will be February 22nd, excuse me, today is February 2nd, at 6:30 p.m. in the auditorium. We're gathered here tonight, and it sounds very kind of marital, but nonetheless, we're gathered here to celebrate the opening of the exhibit, If We Must Die, We Will Fight to the Death. Resistance and Revolt Aboard the Slave Ship. A remarkable installation curated by our own Dr. Joseph Jordan. Give it up for Dr. Jordan. As you know, Vice Provost Jordan precedes me as the director of this magnificent center. This is his last curated exhibit as director of the Stone Center, but we hope and pray that it will not be his last. And oh, what a finale it is. In this moment, it brings to our attention the timeliness of now and the timeliness of this moment, particularly when excavating our past troubles so many. Ron DeSantis among them. The exhibit will run from its opening today until April 30th. So due to some unforeseen travel changes, the exhibition artist, Ms. Tony Scott, will not be here in person, but she will still be in the room with us, okay? She'll be in the room to introduce us to her work. So I'm not going to take up a whole lot more of your time, but as someone who's pretty new to campus, giving some context of how the night is going to unfold feels important, at least it is for me. I'm opening up and I will soon pass the mic to Dr. Jordan. We will then hear from our distinguished guest, Dr. Rediker, who is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. And I won't wax too eloquent about all of his wonderful accomplishments and accolades, but I do want to bring your attention to three of his works, The Slave Ship, A Human History, the Amistad Rebellion, and Atlantic Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom, which was the basis of the third work that I want to bring your attention to, his prize-winning documentary film, Ghosts of Amistad in the Footsteps of the Rebels. What I want to say about Dr. Rediker is that he has really built a career educating us about histories from below, right? Using the historical archive to excavate our past so that we might better understand our present and intervene in our collective futures. He has given us ways to critically engage the question, what might it mean to be free? And to even consider the true meaning of the words successful and unsuccessful as it relates to resistance and survival in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. I know Dr. Rediker is going to give us much food for thought, and so I'm going to step out of the way momentarily. But I also want to let you know, after Dr. Jordan gets the mic and Dr. Rediker offers us a lecture, we'll have time for a Q&A, just a few moments. From there, we will transition to the Robert and Sally Brown Gallery and Museum to engage and explore. Now, in the gallery, you'll also find a place to reflect and even to write your experiences as you encounter them. We're glad that you have come out tonight. We hope that you will return to this space time and time again, that you will mull on what it is that you will see, that you will hear, and you experience, and that you will allow it, as I would say, from my home in South Carolina, to marinate a bit, provoke a bit before you return and before it leaves. The gallery is open from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. I also want to say, just in closing, just my great shout out and big ups, as we would also say, to the staff of the Stone Center and our student workers who have really done the lion's share of work. I will now turn it over to Dr. Jordan and look forward to hearing and meeting and seeing as many of you as possible. Thank you.
So like most of you, I want to hurry up and get to the main event. So I don't have too much to say. Just thank you all for coming out. I want to re-emphasize what Dr. Ron said about the way the Stone Center works. There's a lot of people that run around and do all of the work and all of the good stuff, and then I get to come up here and act like it was me. But I want you to look in the back, and those 4 people that you see in the back, there's another one on the other side hiding. Those are the ones that came here on Saturdays and Sundays to help install the exhibition, that did the background research in many cases, that told me when things didn't look right multiple times at different points. But as far as I'm concerned, they are the lifeblood of this center. What I will say before asking Professor Rediker to join us, and I think much of what Ron says kind of serves as an introduction. If you look around, much of what we've been doing with exhibitions, much of what we've been doing with programs has a lot to do with this theme of resistance. I think that it was by happenstance that I looked to see that the theme for this year's Black History Month was resistance. I had no idea when I selected or determined that I wanted to do this. And I had wanted to do this for a number of years. Not only did I wanted to do it, I wanted to commission a 1-act play to go along with it. I wanted to do a little musical piece with spoken word, and I wanted to do it really big. Alas, however, there's a thing called North Carolina State Legislature that allocates money to different units around the state. So we scaled it down and decided we'll just bring the stars and let them shine. So that's what we'll be doing this evening. Hopefully when Professor Rediker comes up, he will also introduce us to Professor Ritchie, who's joined us. So happy you were able to come up. But let me say this, and instead of introducing Marcus, I will tell you the online conversation that we had when I invited him. And he's such a gracious person, because out of the blue, I wrote him, and I think he was in Italy at the time. So pulling someone away from being in Italy to talk about coming to Chapel Hill in the dead of winter is not an easy task. And he, said, well, what would I do? And what is the theme and how would it work? And I gave him I gave him the pitch, and I said that I'm asking you to come because you are a scholar activist. I am drawn to individuals who don't separate their intellectual and scholarly work from the work of the people. That is absolutely the foundation of what I've tried to do here at the Stone Center over the past 20, 21, and 22 years. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited that Professor Manigault Bryan is here is that we are at a moment. Ron kind of intimated it, but I do want to say that Black history of other people who are quote unquote at the bottom is under attack. Not to mention Black lives in general. But I think we're at a moment where scholars are going to be challenged directly to make a contribution to this fight. And the fight occurs in a number of different kinds of ways, but whatever it is, and as my people who used to inspire me said, you don't select where you fight wherever you happen to be. So at this moment, we happen to be at a place that's going to be very, very difficult for us. And I'm looking forward to the scholar activist in Marcus. I know he's going to slip in a few here and there, and I'm happy that we had him and brought him back from Italy. I have to keep saying that because I was thinking about that. Would I have even spoken to someone if I was in Italy? I would not have even entertained a conversation. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Rediker.
Greetings, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here. It is my great pleasure to be with you. I'd like to thank Joseph for this invitation. I told him that even by email, he was a very persuasive man. I'd like to thank Saskia and Sharif for their many kindnesses in organizing my visit. I'd like to congratulate Dr. Ron on this moment of her taking over as the leader of this institution. I must say this invitation has meant more to me than I can easily say because it enabled me to attend the University of Pittsburgh UNC basketball game last night. I work with the Pitt men's basketball team. I have helped to recruit some of our players, but maybe the less said about that, the better. But anyway, it is an honor to be at the Stone Center. It is an honor to help to participate in the opening of this exhibition, which I was able to see. And this is important. This is timely. And congratulations to you, Joseph, and to everyone associated with the center for this work. I'll also mention here my friend Jeff Kerr Ritchie, whose work on the Creole Mutiny is featured. You want to wave, Jeff, so people will know who you are? I do encourage people to read that book, and you will find it on display next door. Okay, so we meet at a time when Black history is under attack. But I want to say that there is good news, which is that it is under attack because we are winning the battle for a better and truer version of American history. Got to keep that in mind. Got to keep in mind the fact that people have been working on these subjects ever since the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. Other movements have demanded new kinds of history, and 2 generations of historians have tried to provide it. So there's tremendous progress that needs to be part of our thinking about this moment of reaction. Okay, so I want to talk to you today. My talk is entitled The Legacy of the Slave Ship. And this talk is going to have 3 parts. First, I want to present the main conclusions of a book that I wrote, which Dr. Ron mentioned, The Slave Ship, A Human History. I want to talk to you about, secondly, the personal odyssey of writing that book, what I learned about race in America as I did that work. And thirdly, I want to talk about the legacy of the slave ship, how it affects us today, and specifically why we must teach this painful lesson. It's critical at this time, especially. In my view, the slave ship is a ghost ship. It is still sailing. We live with its consequences every minute of every day in this country, and we need to think about this history, even though it's difficult. It's a painful, difficult history. Okay, let me spend a minute just talking about the background to the slave trade. I'm sure many of you know that the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, is one of the most important events in all of world history. There's no other way to put it. Now, it's maybe odd to talk about something that went on for almost 400 years as an event. Truth is, it's made up of tens of thousands of other events, meaning the sailing of these slave ships from West Africa primarily to the plantation societies of the America. But this is crucial to the origins and rise of capitalism, the social and political order that we live with right now. The slave trade is crucial to that, and it's really central to world history. So let's start with the romance of the ship. Pushing all the buttons and nothing's happening. Saskia, you can just control the movement of the slide. There we go. Okay. Has everyone seen these replicas of tall ships? They're really powerful. They're beautiful. They're majestic. But you need to understand that this is the most important machine to the making of modern capitalism. This ship is how a small group of countries on the western edge of the Eurasian Peninsula established dominance around the world through ships just like this. The gunned warship, which combined cannon and firepower, tremendous mobility and speed, and was crucial to Europe's colonization of the rest of the world. And the way that I always try to get people to imagine, to see the consequences of this process, think of the places in the world where Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French are spoken. It's the result of these kinds of ships. Now, you probably wouldn't have any way of knowing that the ship that I've selected here as an example was a slave ship sailing out of Liverpool in about 1780. If you look closely, you can see just above the water line of the vessel, 4 dark squares. Those are airports. You don't carve squares into the hull of a vessel if you don't have a cargo of living creatures. If you're shipping textiles or lumber or sugar, you don't do that. But this ship was a very specifically important kind of thing. And this romance of the sea that we have does not apply to this ship because people would really rather not think about it. But this, of all tall ships, is the one that had the greatest impact. It contained within it a human reality that is really extreme, violent, full of terror, and all the rest. Now, this Atlantic slave trade was a tremendously profitable undertaking. Portugal led the way in traveling down the coast of West Africa, beginning in the 14th and 15th century, trading originally for gold and ivory, but then beginning to take more and more human commodities on board. Spain got involved. The Netherlands became the great slave trader of the 17th century. Then came France and England and the United States. It was, folks, a mad rush for wealth. Thousands upon thousands of ships deployed. Black gold was what those ships carried. Now, we know a lot about the slave trade because it was such a big business. And the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database has got data on 36,000 voyages. It's freely available. You should go on it. I urge you to visit it. But the latest is that roughly 12.5 million people were loaded onto ships like this. Or let's see the next slide, if we could. This is the slave ship Brooks, a very famous image. I'm sure all of you have seen it before. Of those 12.5 million, somewhere around 10.5 million people were delivered alive on the other side of the Middle Passage. And of course, there's a very big discrepancy between those two numbers. The 2 million people who didn't make it, their dead bodies were brought up every morning from the lower deck and thrown over the rails of the ships to sharks that followed the slave ships all the way across the Atlantic. This was an everyday thing. Every merchant who financed a slaving voyage knew this was going to happen, and they did it anyway. This was the human collateral damage of this trade. We could have the next slide. This is actually a much more realistic vision of what a slave ship looked like. This image was created not by, I want to mention, slave trade merchants or ship captains, but by abolitionists who, in trying to organize against the trade, wanted people to understand in human terms what it actually looked like. This is 482 men, women, and children again, on the slave ship Brooks. And what I want you to know about this is that this number of people is the number on a ship like the Brooks after humanitarian legislation had been passed in 1788, something called the Dolben Act, that limited the tight packing or crowding of slave ships. We have a record of this particular ship that on one time it carried not 482 people into the killing maw of the plantation system, it carried 740. And I ask you, where would you put them? You know, we have the exact measurements of this ship because some abolitionists went on board and measured it. You would pile body on top of body on top of body. And imagine the moments when epidemics broke out on the lower deck. You know, every book is written not only as a positive interpretation of something that's happened, it's also written against other interpretations. And I want to tell you that one of the things my book is written against is the excessively statistical portraits of the slave trade that dissolve human beings into numbers. This I call the violence of abstraction. And this is a great danger because there are a lot of historians who just want to talk about the numbers shipped, how long the voyages took, what was the mortality rate. And my answer is always, let's talk about this as something that happened to real people at a real moment in time. So the challenge is to imagine the slave trade as a human experience. This was the main goal of my book. I think I probably had the biggest breakthrough in doing this work when I tried to imagine not only what a slave ship looked like, but what it sounded like, what it smelled like. Think of the soundscape of a slave ship. Cough of people who were sick, the death rattle as people died, the barking orders of the captain, the sound of the lash, the songs of enslaved women, lamentations they were called as they tried to remember their African families. I struggle to remember history, and for which, singing those songs, they would be punished. This is the soundscape. The slave ship, it was said in Charleston, South Carolina, that when the wind was blowing the right way off of the Atlantic Ocean, you could smell a slave ship before you could see it. That's quite a statement. Sickness, seasickness, the smell that the human body makes under conditions of great fear. We may have military veterans in the audience. And you know what kind of smell is accompanied by combat. It's very pungent. There is a smell of bondage that is very, very important. Now, if I had to sum up the single most important conclusion of the book that I wrote, I'd put it this way. The slave ship was one big instrument of terror. It ruled people by terror. The slave ship captain was a terrorist. This is not an individual moral failure, although it is certainly that. It's a requirement of the job to terrorize the people on board. The ship was an instrument of terror. Calculated use of violence to try to cow people into submission. Of course, it never entirely worked because people kept fighting back. And if we could have the next. So if the slave ship itself is an instrument of torture, there were many smaller instruments of torture that made it up. The hardware of bondage. At the top right, the hand manacles, where the wrist of one person would be attached to the wrist, the left wrist of one to the right wrist of another. At the lower end of the illustration, shackles for the ankle. The left ankle of one person to the right ankle of another. All men were manacled and shackled in this way, and women, if they resisted, were also shackled. The other two items pictured here are, I think, very important. In the middle left is thumb screws. This is just an instrument of torture. It had no other purpose. Every slave ship captain had one, and whenever there was a conspiracy or an uprising, the leaders of that conspiracy would have their thumbs placed under those metal loops. The turning of the screw resulted in the crushing of people's thumbs, and extraordinary. And the instrument on the right in the middle is something called the speculum oris. You see, and we're going to talk about resistance in a minute, the slave trade was in many ways a 400-year hunger strike, because the refusal to eat was one of the very few weapons that people had at their disposal. But slave ship captains were not going to allow these people to undermine their profits if they could help it. So they brought the speculum oris. You'd have to imagine this instrument with the three prongs in a closed position, in which it would be placed down the throat of a hunger striker, turning the screw at the top, opening up the throat from within so that some liquid food, gruel of some kind, could be poured down that person's throat into their stomach to keep them alive so that they could be sold for profits at the end of the voyage. It's hard to take, but we need to face it. And then, of course, to the left here is the lash, the cat o' nine tails. The lash was probably the most important small instrument of power on board the ship. It was in constant use. You see the knots at the end of the threads. Some captains threaded wire through the leather so that it would cut human flesh more efficiently. And when there was a rebellion, and there were a great many of them, most of them failed in some way. We'll talk about that too, what's success and what isn't. The ringleaders would be brought in a great spectacle onto the main deck in full view of everyone else, and they would be tortured to death, sending the message that if you dare to resist us, this is what will happen to you. Okay, so the slave ship is defined by terror, and the number of slave ships was great. But here's the consequence, the main consequence of the numbers, okay? The main consequence of all these numbers is, as C.L.R. James said, a great West Indian scholar activist, the result of these numbers is the greatest planned accumulation of wealth the world had ever seen in the slave trade and the Atlantic slave system. The greatest accumulation of wealth the world had ever seen up to that time. Folks, this is why there have to be reparations. Many generations of unpaid labor, and all of it based on violence. Let's take that on board. Okay, let me turn now to the experience of writing the book. And yeah, this was quite an experience. The origins of this book lay deep in the bowels of a supermax prison as I was visiting a political prisoner you may know by the name of Mumia Abu Jamal, a former Black Panther who was falsely convicted of killing a police officer in Philadelphia in 1981. Mumia was allowed to have one visitor a week for 2 hours, and I visited him a great many times, and since he had so few visitors, we would talk about whatever he wanted to talk about. He was very interested in history. On one particular meeting, he told me about the moment when a guard slid through the slit in his door a signed death warrant, meaning that he had a date to die. Now, I'm happy to tell you he's still alive, although he is still in prison. The movement to free Mumia Abu Jamal was not strong enough to get him out of prison, but we did get him off death row, and we did prevent the state of Pennsylvania from executing him. So it was a bit of a stalemate. But anyway, we're talking about this moment where he gets this document. And he says, yeah, it's the old story of race and terror. This is a moment meant to be a moment of terror to him, this execution. And we started talking about the history of race and terror. And it hit me in that meeting that I could write about the origins of that, because that connection between race and terror began on the slave ship. But I didn't immediately decide that I was going to write the book, because it was a daunting idea, primarily for two reasons. First of all, the kind of history that I write, history from below, meant that I would have to spend several years living with this horror of the slave ship. But that was actually less important than the second reason, which was that in thinking about writing this kind of book, I realized that a heavy moral responsibility comes with it. Can you do justice to the experience of the people who were on those vessels? And I don't know if I did justice to it. That will be for readers to decide. But I decided that it would be better to try and fail than not to try at all. So I began to write this book in around 2002. I worked on it for 5 years. I lived with the terror for 5 years. The book was published finally in October 2007. And in the immediate period after the publication of the book, I probably did more than 100 talks about the book. I've probably done 150 or so since then. But talks, interviews, radio spots. I was on Southern Christian Evangelical Radio. I got interviewed by hip hop DJs. One guy said this book was stomping, and I guess that meant it was good. But I was also on right-wing talk radio. Kind of surprising. I spoke in libraries, public libraries, museums, bookstores, universities, spoke to a lot of community groups. And I think probably the most interesting talk that I ever gave about the slave ship was at Auburn Prison in upstate New York. And I'd be happy to say more about that, but I don't know if you know, but incarcerated people call the prison the modern slave ship. So this had an electric charge to it, this talk, because everything that we discussed about the slave ship had an immediate implication for people who were incarcerated. Now, what I learned in giving all these talks and being part of these discussions is that there is a tremendous amount of emotion out there surrounding this topic. Emotions of many different kinds. There is, of course, a stunning amount of grief, just grief that it happened. Grief compounded by the fact that many people won't even admit that it happened. Sadness, anger at the slave trade and its human consequences, but also quite a lot of anger at me for telling the story. I got a tremendous amount of hate mail. You know, it's not over, because one of the lectures I gave on the slave ship was filmed by C-SPAN. It was showed, I think, in 2007 or 2008, but they re-air that lecture every year or so. And every time it comes on the TV, I get more hate mail. Now, I expected this. When you deal with a subject that is surrounded by repression, people are going to be angry if you try to bring it out into the light of day and talk about it. The emotion. shame, guilt. But there was also a hunger to know. There was a willingness I felt to take on board this subject. There was a gratitude that a lot of people expressed for the history. A gratitude for the recognition. You know, that's a first step in all this, the recognition. And even a little hope. Now, in all these talks that I give, inevitably, almost in every single one, at some point in the Q&A, a white person would stand up and say, my family came from Eastern Europe in 1910. We had nothing to do with it. And I would say, really? You had nothing to do with it? Well, why do you think your ancestors came here? It's because they were looking for jobs. Why do you think there were better jobs available in America than there were in other places? Why do you think the wealth that created those jobs was somehow created only by the industrial workers like your ancestors who immigrated? The wealth of the nation, a large part of the wealth of the nation was created by slavery. And so industrialization, we increasingly learn from the latest scholarship, was built on slavery. Cotton was the leading commodity of the Industrial Revolution. So you can't stand outside of this history. You can't, but the denial, the urge to deny is fierce. Okay, so let me conclude by talking about the burden of history. The burden of history. And let me say something else. Now, this is really obvious. This is really obvious, but we forget. All this is so recent. All this happened very, very recently. I am sure that within 25 miles of Chapel Hill, we could find people who are the great-grandchildren of enslaved people in this country. There might be people in this room who fit that description. Folks, this has just happened in the scale of historical time. It's recent. The wounds are recent. Okay, but here's the good news. For the last 60 years, as I mentioned at the outset, I would argue that scholars have created, in their study of slavery and resistance to slavery, have created the greatest body of scholarship anywhere in the world during the same time period. What we know about the institution of slavery now is just extraordinary. Now, it is true that there is a great disjunct between what scholars know and what people in the public school system, public education system know. And we've got to work on that. We've got to work on that. I think the Stone Center could play a very important part in all this. But this body of scholarship is really crucial for our sense of who we are as a nation. Right? It is who we are, whether we like it or not. You can spend all your time denying it, but that doesn't make that denial true. So in my view, we have to teach the terror, and we also have to teach the resistance. And if we could have the next slide, please. The resistance, because another finding, and this is by no means mine alone, lots of people have worked on this, the cooperation and the communication of enslaved people aboard these ships was quite extraordinary. This is actually an image of the lower deck of a Spanish slave ship captured by the British Navy. And a naval lieutenant by the name of Maynall went below and sketched what he saw. What do you see? You see people talking. That's what happened on the lower deck of every slave ship. People talked. People developed new languages. People sang new songs. People danced new dances. And I want to give special emphasis to two things. The most common language they had. Now you got to remember that on board the the typical slave ship of 300 people, there are 15 to 20 different West African nationalities or ethnic groups. So a lot of people spoke languages they couldn't understand each other, and some slave ship captains deliberately mixed the linguistic groups so they could not cooperate. Right? But they found a way. They found a way. Resistance is crucial to this, because when you fight back, everybody knows the meaning of that no matter what language they see. So the building on the lower deck of what a lot of historians have called cultures of resistance is really crucial, and they are going to be carried off the ship into the plantation society. Okay? And probably the greatest creativity in all of this is the creation of what anthropologists call fictive kinship. Enslaved people on the lower deck start calling each other brother and sister. Now, their lives, their West African societies were based on kinship, but those structures had been shattered with enslavement. So what do people do? They started rebuilding some sense of kinship, some sense of community on board those vessels. This is unbelievable. It's extraordinary. This is a tremendous achievement. So within the vessel of howling misery, you have, if you look at it from one point of view, you have the origins of Pan-African culture. If you look at it from another point of view, from the Western Atlantic, you have the origins of African-American culture. Not American in a national sense, but in a hemispheric sense, because the cultural compromises and accommodations that people will make, that's part of a process of building a culture that's new, that is not strictly reducible to West Africans' history. Okay, so slavery and the slave trade. To conclude, this is not just a tragedy. This is not just a set of atrocities. We can have the next slide. This is what we increasingly understand to be a crime against humanity, in which entire societies are affected for many generations. I'll mention 4 main effects of the slave trade and slavery as a crime against humanity: discrimination, poverty, deep structural inequality, and one that we don't talk about nearly enough, premature death. Slavery created premature death in a really massive way. And we still live with that differential in life expectancy. That is still with us. But of course, people fought back. You have pictured behind me an insurrection. People fought back. Got to teach the resistance alongside the terror. They go together, they're inseparable. And that's why this exhibition next door is so important, because you have to teach the fact that people never accepted that reality aboard the slave ship. And even when they had no hopes of winning, they kept fighting. I read a very moving account by a ship's physician about a man who had managed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to get through all the netting that slave ship captains put up around the rails of the vessel to keep people from jumping overboard. He managed to get through that and get out into the deep water of the Atlantic, where he was surely going to die. And the physician noted that the man was exultant in his happiness. He believed that his soul, when he died, would go home to his native land. He was going to be eaten alive by sharks, but he was happy. He had successfully resisted. I think that's powerful. And if we could have the final slide. I talked about the origins of this project in SCI Green Supermax Prison. Here's a piece of political art by an artist named David Thorne. 1998, in which he has superimposed on top of that image of the Brooks, the cell layout of a modern prison. And the title of this is Too Soon for Sorry, meaning the consequences of the slave ship live on in the modern system of incarceration. And there's so much work to be done to dismantle all that, that apologies are not enough. So in my view, slave ship is still a ghost ship. It's still sailing. It's still haunting us, but we have made a lot of progress in bringing it into the public light of talking about this. And I'm hoping that the Stone Center will, I think you've probably done this kind of thing many times in the past, redouble your efforts to work with school teachers. And I'm telling you, there are a lot of school teachers out there who are hungry for this kind of knowledge. And I know this from personal experience because my daughter is a 9th grade public school teacher in New York City. They're the front line of this battle right now, these teachers. So to reach them with this history, with this deep, profound history, that seems to me to be one of the most important political tasks of the day. And I do believe that if we do that, if we do it with courage, and if we do it with political will, we can still overcome the deep damages of this history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for Q&A. Do you want me to moderate or do you feel comfortable fielding? Okay. Yeah, so questions for Dr. Rediker?
Hi, Dr. Rediker. Hi, Dr. Rediker. So I just wanted to ask, I'm well aware that your book was very positively reviewed. I've enjoyed it quite a bit myself, reading it for Dr. Lindsay's class this semester, history seminar about the transatlantic slave trade. I did want to ask, though, what your response is to a few critics that did make a point about how you wrote about the struggles of the crew and the captain in your book. And they took issue with that, seeing as that detracting from the suffering of the slaves. What would be your response to the criticism levied by those few critics?
Yeah, my response is that history from below is never merely history from below. That what you have to do, and what I've tried to do in this book, is understand the slave ship as a system of power. And that necessarily involves the crew, and it involves the captain, and it involves the officers, and it involves the merchants. So I'm just trying to understand how it worked. What was the experience? That's my response.
With the events of the College Board and also what's happening in Florida, how do you feel about the situation? And how do we and teachers also combat the erasing of history?
Yeah, that's a very big question, and I thank you for it. I think what the College Board has done is absolutely disgraceful. I am hoping that the American Historical Association will issue a strong condemnation of what they've done, because it's very clear that they've done it for money. This is all about money. So now this is going to be a hard fight. But it's not the first time state power has been used to suppress knowledge about the human freedom struggle. I'm writing a book right now about the many thousands of people who escaped slavery in the South by sea, by getting on board ships, working with dock workers, sailors, and market women. And as I was preparing for this talk, I started wondering, what would the people who were involved in that struggle have to say to us today? I think specifically of a man who is a very important figure in my book, a man named William Powell, who was a sailor, a black sailor abolitionist. Fascinating figure. And I think he would say, you've got to be willing to break the law. When the law is unjust, as Dr. King taught us, among many others, you have to be willing to fight it. Now, I'm not on the front line of that battle. I don't know what it would mean. I'd like to have some teachers tell me how they would like to wage the battle. It's a really good question. So I can't tell you much about tactics, but I can tell you that there are, I think, very few struggles going on right now that are more important. And you see, all of this is driven, this thing with DeSantis and people all over the country, it's driven by fear. It's driven by the fear that they have lost control of the narrative of American history. And they have. They have lost control of it. This has been going on for a long time. I'll remind people that in the early 1990s, George Bush I commissioned a study for new national American history standards for teaching. So my friend Gary Nash, the late Gary Nash, and other people from the Organization of American Historians, the preeminent professional organization of American historians, reviewed all of the recent social history about the American past, and they came up with a set of guidelines of what should be taught. Slavery played a very big role in that. And when that study came before the US Senate, it was voted down 99-1 against. And you want to know why? Its opponents were very clear. Insufficiently patriotic. By which I think they meant maybe this history wouldn't be too good for young people who might be sent to fight in foreign wars. Right? I think that's actually one of the purposes of education in public schools, to indoctrinate people to make them willing to fight in wars of the American empire. So my point is, this is nothing new. The ruling class of this country, which has changed, is opposed to history from below. They recognize its dangers, and now the fight has reached a new stage. We've got to be ready for that.
Hello, Dr. Rediker. Thank you for your time and your talk. I know that the image of the slave ship Brooks was originally published in, I think it was The Liberator. And what do you think these abolitionist publications lead us into how we remember the legacy of the slave ships, but also what they teach us for our current, activism strategies?
Yes, it's an important point. Now, we've got to remember that the abolitionist movement was made up of many different kinds of people. And for a long time, we thought that the abolitionist movement was basically a bunch of white middle-class abolitionists. But now we see that the first abolitionists are the enslaved. They are the front line of that battle. And they enter into alliances with various people, black and white abolitionists. So I think what we've got to do is study abolitionism from below. What did people do to emancipate themselves? That's maybe the most important thing we can talk about. And in this work that I'm doing now on escaping slavery by sea, see, this is really crucial, because this is not a gift from on high. This is working class people on the waterfront cooperating for their own purposes and managing to get to a northern port where these very radical abolitionist groups called vigilance committees will help them gain their freedom. So I think what this tells us is that movements from below are complex, And you've got to try to recover the voices of the people who were on that cutting edge. And you can't always trust the abolitionist newspapers to provide those. We need a broader, deeper study of that struggle.
Um, yeah, okay, thank you, Dr. Rediker. My first question is, with the connection you've created with the slave ship and modern prisons today, is it safe to say that the origin of surveillance started on slave ships? Given the connection you're trying to create. And my second question is, today we have African Americans who want to retrace their steps back home, back to Africa. And it's sad that people would have to sign on to ancestry.com to find their roots, and people think that it is not a big deal. We find people who say that it's not necessary to do that. But then my big question is there light at the end of the tunnel, because today there's still a lot of repression, and we see that African Americans are resistant. So it's like, although it's a fight, it's a war, but then on land and not on ships. So do we see a better future for generations of African Americans in the future? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. With regard to the second question, I think there is definitely hope. I mean, if you look at what American history textbooks looked like in the 1950s, during the Cold War, at the peak of white supremacy, and look at textbooks now, you'll see a huge difference. We have made some progress. But it's also true that these textbooks are subject to political considerations. And as we've seen in Texas, there is an effort to ban what can be taught, right? So there's kind of a battle over that. So this has been going on for a long time. It will continue to go on. And I think, Black Lives Matter made a big difference in terms of advancing this demand for a new kind of history. So I think we can take hope in that. With regard to your first question, some of you, the connection between the slave ship and the modern prison, some of you may have read a book by Michel Foucault called Discipline and Punish, about the origins of the modern prison. And central to that is a design of a new kind of prison by a man named Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher, something called the panopticon, okay? What Foucault doesn't tell you is that Jeremy Bentham did not invent the panopticon. His brother Samuel Bentham invented it, and Samuel Bentham was a shipmaker who was very closely attuned to all of the dynamics of power. So I think this is actually something that still remains for close study, but I think the connections will be found. No, the mic.
I just had hopefully just a brief piece, because to me it's fascinating. And that is hearing you talk about clarifying the Amistad and the rebellion there, and I don't want you to correct the film, but at least to talk about the organization of that and what really distinguishes it. And
okay, yeah, one of my books, again, which Dr. Ron mentioned, is called the Amistad Rebellion, an Atlantic Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom. And I wrote that book against Steven Spielberg and his film called Amistad. It wasn't against well, although the histories were kind of similar, but basically what it came down to was this. When I was first thinking about that book, I had been writing The Slave Ship, and I saw how unbelievably difficult it was to wage a successful revolt. They almost all failed. Although in some cases, the goal wasn't to capture the ship, but to jump overboard and go home to Guinea, as they put it. Right? So that would be a successful revolt. But in the back of my mind, there's the Amistad revolt of 1839, in which people successfully captured the ship, sailed it 1,600 miles up the east coast of North America, and managed after a complicated legal struggle to win their freedom. But my question was, how did they do it? How did they actually manage to seize the ship? So I went back and read all the scholarship on the Amistad case, and it's been written about for many, many years. And what I discovered is that historians were not interested in the revolt itself. They were only interested in the court case. So there were lots of books where they'd spend 2 pages on the revolt and 200 pages on the court case, in which John Quincy Adams and these white abolitionists play the leading role. So I thought, this is backwards, because without the successful revolt, John Quincy Adams has nobody to represent before the US Supreme Court. So how did the revolt happen? Well, it turns out that the key to the revolt was the experience of the Amistad rebels back in Sierra Leone, where the slaving wars had been going on. And one of the things that all of the villages did was to train their young men to fight. So what you had on the Amistad was 49 trained fighters. And their leader, man we know is Cinque, whose Mende name is Cinquez, Sengbe. They had a debate in the hold of the ship about whether they were going to rise up and try to capture it. And they did. So it was the military history of Sierra Leone that was the key to the successful revolt. So my goal was to put the Amistad rebels back at the center of their own history, and to decenter that narrative that made John Quincy Adams the hero. And again, it was an example of how Atlantic history works. People bearing these African experiences use them in this new context, and that's how they were able to gain their freedom.
Hi, thanks for being here tonight. So you mentioned a bit about just in general, like reparations, and how like all of this unpaid labor, all of this violence for centuries has facilitated like a huge wealth divide. And then you mentioned your 4 pillars: discrimination, poverty, deep structural inequality, and premature death. And I was wondering, I know there's a little bit of talk about reparations that's happening across the country now. I know in Asheville, at least a couple summers ago, they had allocated like $2 million or something really minuscule for reparations. And that was specifically geared towards their urban renewal that had displaced Black families. But I was wondering, based on what you know and how you studied, if you were to answer the question, what would be appropriate reparations for the African Americans in the United States? How would you answer that? And then what would those reparations specifically be addressing? Because I know there are like a lot of different stages where reparations could address.
Yeah, my answer to this is that it's not my place to say. And that is not a cop-out. That's a recognition that the people who should be deciding about reparations are the people who are the direct descendants of those people who suffered on board the slave ship. I think that's a really important point. But there is a lot of discussion of reparations now. You should have Sandy Darity come over from Duke and give a talk. Maybe you already have. So read his book. But there are many, many different forms that reparations can take. Most people are under the mistaken attitude that it's just a matter of cash payment. Now, it can be that, but it could also be, for example, something like a Marshall Plan for US cities, massive reinvestment in the inner city, which would raise the quality of life for many, many people. So there are many different ways to do this. And I personally am encouraged. I mean, I have watched over the years, John Conyers, congressman from Michigan, for many years introduced House Bill 40. And the 40 comes from the 40 acres and a mule demand. And year after year after year after year, it was voted down. Well, there's been some progress on that, and localities, you're right, are taking very small steps, but they're trying to do something. There's an acknowledgement that this is an issue. So I think this is a movement that is very likely to gather steam over the long term, but we've got to always keep in mind that at the heart of this is the massive inequality that slavery created, right? There's no escaping that. We've got to put that right at the heart of our analysis. And I do think that reparations are going to become more important, not less. As the only way really to deal with the issues of injustice.
You talked about the importance. You talked about the importance of restoring. Excuse me. You spoke about the importance of disseminating information and the fact that it is readily available now. And based on what you said it was very important for it to be done in schools. And as a professor, you do that in academia. And I was wondering what other ways you imagine that occurring, or what ways you in your work have worked to disseminate it and make it accessible for many people outside of the school.
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the most important things that goes on in any movement is education. What kind of education do you have in the labor movement? What kind of education do you have in anti-imperialist movements? And I think maybe the best example of this lately has been the prison abolition movement, which I think is really important. Angela Davis, my friend, played a very important role in this work in California in the 90s. It's grown massively, and teaching the history of racialized incarceration becomes crucial to that project, right? So in a very real sense, the way we have to look at teaching history is, what do you want to change? What's your analysis of what needs to change? And how then do you learn about the history that will strengthen that desire for change? I might mention that I think the book that I'm going to write after this one, the one on escaping slavery by sea, is a history of basically how to do history from below for movement activists. How to do the history of the group that you are fighting for. And I do think that historians can be very useful for that. They need to learn to listen. They need to go to these movements and talk to people and see what they are trying to accomplish. But there are very good models for that. A dear friend of mine named Stoughton Lynd, who was one of the great activists of the 20th century, just passed away a few months ago. He's written a book called Accompanying, which is all about how people with the advantage of education, for example, can participate in movements from below in highly ethical ways. Sorry? Can, have, in his case. This is based on liberation theology, by the way. So I think there are a lot of models of how to do this work, and I think in addition to the strategic connection between scholars, historians, and teachers, another one would be scholars, teachers, and activists, because that's where some of the most important learning takes place. I think, again, it was C.L.R. James who said, people learn history when they're making history. And I think that's a situation that we need to be attentive to.
Join me in thanking Dr. Rediker. I just want to point out that this is in many ways our transition and not the end necessarily, right? So we're going to move over to the gallery space. I want to bring your attention to this document, which you will have access to, which is, when you open it, it is a remarkable testament, I think, to a number of things that Dr. Rediker is bringing to our attention, but particularly because of the ways that it lists the successes and unsuccesses, right? You know, of slave revolts. It is a powerful, powerful document to hold. So I encourage you to pick one up as well. We will move over to the gallery at this time for the formal opening. Thank you.